Hi everyone, my name is Jennie Lynch. Welcome to our webinar today. Today we'll be discussing the future of clinical research, driving innovation and adopting digital technology. I am a senior market advisor with Enterprise Ireland, focusing on life sciences and based in our Boston office. I'm joined today by Kim Boericke, President of ICON Commercialization and Outcomes. Kim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Jenny. I'm Kim Boericke. I'm the president of ICON's Commercialization and Outcome Services, which tends to focus on the phase 3B, phase 4 space. So really looking at the end of clinical research from a registrational standpoint as it moves into market authorization and post-marketing commitments. I'm really excited to be here today. Looking forward to having a chat.
Perfect. Us too, Kim. Thank you so much for your time. Before we dive right in, I will just say that there should be some time for Q&A at the end of the webinar, but if anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat box and we'll get to them at the end. Okay, so Kim, first and foremost, once again, thank you for your time. I know that you're incredibly busy. We really appreciate having you here with us today. To kick things off, I wanted to just ask, how are things at ICON? How has the company managed during what really has been an unprecedented year so far?
Yes, it has. It's been an unprecedented year that I don't think anybody in clinical research has seen in their careers. I have to say the company has done really well. We had a lot of challenge moving from Q1 into Q2, especially at the height of the first wave of COVID hitting. We saw a lot of countries close down. We saw many sites close down and a real slowdown in the number of trials starting, the number of patients being enrolled in those trials over that course of time. We also had a lot of challenge because we couldn't deploy our traveling monitors out to those sites. And so we really had to think about how do you de-risk clinical research. And I think it's very timely because there's been a lot of evolution and a lot of change happening in our area anyway. But seeing that now all of a sudden you had an immediate need that you needed to be able to deploy quickly to keep things going made for a very interesting second quarter. And I have to say, across the board, as we moved in and closed out third quarter, we're starting to see a return to what we're calling the new norm at this time. But we definitely saw some good recovery in third quarter.
Absolutely. I think, certainly when the pandemic hit, there was so much that changed so quickly. It was a real struggle, particularly for those within clinical research, to try and keep up with the changes that were taking place. With regards to the focus on those changes and what has come about as a result of the pandemic, and maybe just looking to dive in a little bit more on that innovation side, how do you think, from ICON's perspective, that the innovative technologies we've seen come to the fore, how do you think that they're going to impact on overall digital disruption within the space? What do you think the impact of these transformative technologies will be moving forward?
Well, it's been interesting because prior to COVID, there's been a real focus on patient centricity in clinical research, and really how do you make it easier for a patient to be a participant in trials. The data suggests that patients that are in clinical trials feel that they receive better patient care because they're seeing their doctors more regularly, and that their outcomes tend to be much improved in certain areas. The COVID hit, and then obviously the first thing you need to think about is the patient. And so the impact that we've seen is really been around, how do you get medication directly to a patient? Didn't think about that before because in clinical research, the physician, the primary care, the PI is the one that is always giving the drugs to the patient. And now all of a sudden you have patients in remote areas, you have patients that can't get to a clinic, or you have a clinic that's now closed. So we had to reroute and think about drug distribution from to a point of care that we never had to think about before. So that was something that was rapidly deployed, and I think the team did a really good job around that. We were also able to leverage our direct to patients. So within my organization, we have a group that really follows patients directly. And so we were able to leverage that where we could on certain protocols to reach out to patients and make sure that we were following them and whether that was done through smartphones and kind of patient reported outcome surveys or just telephone and just talking to the patients, we were able to do that. I would say the other areas, the other two areas around that were really being able to deploy nurses. So we acquired Symphony at the end of last year, and Symphony just kind of exploded this year with COVID hitting, and having the ability to send a nurse remotely out to a patient's home and have a study visit be done there, and then actually collect the source documentation while at the patient's home, and then be able to bring that back in electronically into the database was critically important for us as well. And then for our monitoring group, where they normally go to a site to look at the eligibility and the safety aspects of the trial around the patients, we had to really start to deploy either eSource, which allowed us to electronically look at the source document materials without actually being at the site, or using straight extraction from electronic medical records to pull the data into our data environments, were the areas that we really had to, we really started to leverage more than we had in the past. So we saw a huge increase in what we call remote monitoring, from low 15–20%, we were up towards 70–80% of our trials were actually using remote monitoring over the last 6 months. So it's been nice to see kind of an evolution. Unfortunately, science usually evolves really fast in crises, and I guess our industry is no different.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I think that piece that you mentioned with regards to facilitating patient care during COVID has been one of the main challenges for anyone within the industry at the moment. You know, you mentioned that whereby it would have been just a very straightforward process of bringing the patient to the trial. The trial now needs to go to the patient, and that's a lot easier said than done, as we're all experiencing at the moment. So focusing a little bit more on clinical research and on, you know, what these changes will mean for ICON and for the industry more broadly, how do you feel the digital disruption in particular might transform clinical research industry moving forward? And more broadly, do you think that this is the right direction for the industry to be moving in? I know we've certainly talked a little bit about, you know, some of the advantages, but though getting to those advantages have not been easy, not been without challenge. So is this the right direction that we're all very, very quickly moving towards right now?
Well, it's been really interesting, because as you see the evolution of transformative technology starting to impact our day-to-day lives every day, we're also starting to see more regulations coming out around data protection, personal protection. And so you have a balance between having technology be able to drive and give you access to things more rapidly, but then you have the restrictions of what you actually have access to and what you're allowed to pull back and forth. So I think right now we're kind of at a tug and pull a bit, going back and forth in regards to making things easier by being able to go in and extract information directly from a system, but then, you know, having some guards around what you can actually extract out of the system. And that even comes to taking data and whether you can use a global trial and be able to pull all your global data together into one database in one location, or whether you need to retain country-specific information in each of the individual countries. So there's a lot of regulation going on and rules kind of being put into play as the underlying technologies are advancing really, really quickly. So I think for the industry, it's going to be better, because I do think at the end of the day, there is a significant burden that we do put on an investigator and we put on the patient in clinical research. And you can see that burden has increased over time as the technology's increased and the capabilities are there, whether it's using patients now needing smartphones to be able to answer questions, whether they're wearing sensors, whether they're wearing other wearables for the monitoring of the data that's being collected in those trials. So I think as we balance that out and figure out what information do we actually need in order to support the primary objectives of the study and to ensure patient safety, that's going to be an interesting thing that's going to evolve. The other area is really around data and access to data. So what you're seeing today is that as you start moving towards these trials, they're becoming more pragmatic, more real world. So traditionally in clinical research, a protocol is written for a specific endpoint, and you're, in the purest sense, you want to just be looking at the science around that one endpoint. And we're humans, and we have lots of different things going on with us. And it's very hard to find a patient that only has that one thing. And when you need 100 of them or 1,000 of them that just have that one thing, it's a very narrow scope that you're looking at. What we're seeing now is the evolution of you as a person. So your real world, you might have high blood pressure, you might have diabetes, you might have something else, and we're studying a certain endpoint for a certain investigational product. And so they're taking them in now. And so now you're thinking, okay, do I need to enroll 3 times as many patients in a trial, or can I use a historic control? Can I look at you from your last couple of years and take that as a control against you in a trial? So there's a big evolution around how do you use data better to hopefully reduce the total number of patients that you might need on a trial, but still give you the robust endpoints and the differentiation that you can see the benefits of the investigational product over time. So I think that's been a big evolution that we're going to see, and I think that'll continue on as we go forward. But once again, it's all around the rules and, you know, what are you allowed to do with the data and stuff to make sure that you still are in control of your own patient information, and nobody knows who you are when it gets aggregated into the bigger population.
And do you think, Kim, you know, that the risks associated with the new innovation that we're seeing within this industry, you mentioned, you know, the more traditional increased burden on a patient, you know, you mentioned the advent of digital endpoints. Do you think that some of the new innovation we're seeing coming in will alleviate any of these more traditional challenges within clinical research and clinical trials?
That part, I would say there's going to be an easier part if you can move more towards a decentralized trial. And I think you're never going to get fully decentralized in every therapeutic area. I mean, there's certain things you have to go to a clinic for, and that is the safest way to do it. And I mean, most patients aren't going to take samples from themselves, or, you know, we don't really have the capability of doing home imaging at this point in time. So there's the hybrid of a decentralized trial where you can reduce the burden by allowing some things to be done in the home environment versus actually going to a clinic, I think is really going to be seen across almost every protocol going forward. I do think there is a lot that can be done remotely via telemedicine. COVID really pushed telemedicine out to the forefront right now, and that a lot of people are still using telemedicine for just not having to go to the doctor for risk of exposure. So just for regular patients, not even for patients on trials. So I do think you're going to see a lot more of these hybrid approaches as we continue on in research well past the pandemic era, to allow less time in the office, less of a burden. I also think it will create greater access. So you can have a site in a location and you can have patients in much broader area. And if you look at research, we're doing a lot more in the rare disease area. Even oncology in and of itself is a bunch of rare diseases. So I think that'll allow us to get greater access to the right type of patients we need, and also to move our trials through faster, and hopefully bring the cost down, because that's the other side of it is every one of those visits, every one of the times you're going into the site, it gets more expensive. And
they add
traditional,
up, absolutely.
it still takes 10 years and about $2 billion to get a drug to market. So I think everybody's looking for ways we can do it a little bit cheaper, but still not reduce the quality and the safety aspects around the patient and protection there.
So a couple of things that you mentioned there in that response really nicely tie into my next question, which is going to focus on the advent of decentralized trials. A lot of advantages, you mentioned a few with regards to decentralized trials, you know, an increased accessibility to patient cohorts, reduced cost, can definitely speed up the process overall. Maybe talk to us a little bit now about what ICON is doing with regards to its decentralized strategy and direct to patient strategies moving forward.
Well, we've been pulling in services and offerings that have allowed us to move into this hybrid space. So we're almost there. I would say the biggest area when you start looking at decentral trials is really around data aggregation and integration. Most companies have the capability of using an e-consent. There's a lot of telemedicine companies out there that you can partner with or leverage to be able to have your visits done remotely. We acquired a nursing service that we can deploy study coordinators and nurses to the home. We've got direct patient capabilities. We've got clinical outcome assessments, patient-reported outcome capabilities that can be done on a smartphone or a tablet or over the phone. So we've got all the pieces and components, but it's really being able to aggregate all that data in one place so that you've got the data ready and able to be analyzed in a rapid manner to move your trial forward. We're spending a lot of time and investment really on looking at how do you put a backbone in place that allows all this data to pool in one spot, and then you're able to plug and play different components that you may need for different trials. Not every trial needs patient-reported outcomes, but some will need clinical outcome assessments done by the physician. You need telemedicine. You need to be able to get the actual clinical data in-house. You've got all the lab information that needs to come in. You need to be able to deploy your drug and then account for that drug over time at the patient. So we've got a unit now within ICON that's specifically focused on decentralized trials that I'm actually one of the co-sponsors for. So myself and Nuala Murphy, who's the president of our registrational division, trial division, is co-sponsoring, and the focus is really to be able to stand up a truly decentralized end-to-end solution. But that solution needs to be able to enable pieces and parts so that we can use it on every trial going forward as needed. So that's really what our focus is right now.
And I mean, has there been any challenges internally from an ICON standpoint with regards to the move and the drive towards decentralized trials? I know that the hybrid approach is certainly something that ICON is moving towards, and you mentioned the acquisition of the nursing organization. I believe you're talking about Accellacare, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But you know, are there challenges that, you know, not only have been experienced by ICON, but you would maybe say could be experienced for other companies in the broader space with regards to this drive towards decentralized trials?
Actually, yeah, there's still a lot of hurdles and burdens, and I think everybody's kind of dipping their toe in the space. And what you're seeing is I would say there's widely acceptance on hybrid, so pieces and parts of it being pushed to being more decentralized. The end-to-end one becomes more of a challenge because now you're getting into the data privacy areas and the movement of data across countries, rules and regulations within countries around medical practice, how people are allowed to prescribe. So for instance, in my space, we were running a fully decentralized trial in the States because regulations are very clear, and it's one set of regulations because it's one country versus trying to run it globally right now. But even when you start looking at that and you look at medical care in the United States, you can't have necessarily one investigator sitting in one state being able to run a patient population across the entire United States because they cannot prescribe across certain state lines. They may have agreement with the medical license in a state to be able to write a script across 1 or 2 state lines, but definitely not all 50. And so just that burden alone, you're all of a sudden thinking, oh, well, you know, 1 PI, 1 country, is that feasible or not feasible? So these are the little challenges that you don't think of as being, oh, that shouldn't be that big of an issue, until you start getting down to the kind of the minutia, the nitty gritty. And that's really why we decided to put this focused team together, to be able to really look at end to end, because you do need to understand where your barriers are and what barriers are removable and which ones aren't, and therefore you need a different way to get around them. And that's something that I think will continue as we start moving in. There's also certain therapeutic areas, I would say, that lend themselves, or we'll say phases too, because it's not just therapeutic areas, but phases of research that lend itself more towards a decentralized approach. Right now, oncology is probably not the #1 trial design that you would go into and try to make it completely decentralized. But as you move into the post-marketing space and you're in a registry, that may be the perfect time where you can move into a fully decentralized space, because it's general medical care. A lot of it can be done through telemedicine and home visits. And so you can potentially get very far through a fully virtual trial in that space. So that's the other thing we're assessing, is where does it make sense? And it really comes down to looking at every protocol that comes across and determining what procedures can actually be moved to a remote setting, or a different approach like telemedicine, or deploying the nursing to be able to fully virtualize a study. And that's kind of the boat we're in right now, is trying to do that assessment with our sponsors. I would say the other challenge is that we work in a very, very conservative, very regulated environment. And so as much as everybody is excited and wants innovation, and a lot of our sponsors are dipping their toes in right now, I'm not sure everybody's ready to fully jump in and take the risk on a large phase 3 registrational study to go fully decentralized and then find out that it's not accepted by an agency. So there's a little bit of who's doing it, who's ahead of the curve, what did they find out, what obstacles did they come up against, what can we share? So I would say the community right now is really about information sharing and figuring out what the risk is and where we can de-risk as much as we can, so we can start enabling more of these technologies.
Absolutely, yeah. I definitely think that everyone is kind of giving one another a little bit of a sideways glance to see who's moving, who's getting ready to take that next step. You mentioned something though with regards to the team that ICON had put together, and I think that that's a wonderful first step with regards to the drive towards this decentralized trial. Is that something that you would advocate for other organizations to do? If you are going to move towards decentralized, you do need to have dedicated resources internally that oversee it and are actively pushing it. Is that something that you would say would be an advantage internally?
I think it is, because I mean, for the last 2 years, we have been looking at decentralized virtual trials, and we had somebody identified that was leading that team, and we were moving things forward. And when it's not the job, it's always hard, because it's the second job, and everybody has a day job, and so they're trying to balance what they can in between. And it hasn't allowed us to take it forward as rapidly as we probably wanted to get it out into the marketplace. So I do think having a group, and it doesn't need to be a big group, it just needs to be a small group that understands the data, the analytics, the technology, and then bringing the regulatory support in to understand any of the hurdles that are out there, to really be able to stand up the solution, at which point you can then look at taking that solution and deploying it across your operating models and being able to advance them as part of a new way of doing business. But I think in order to really understand the space, you need a team that's focused on it. I would definitely suggest that.
Definitely. So I think, and you'd mentioned it, and then I also mentioned it, I think that this will probably be a good point for us to talk a little bit more about Accellacare, the recent launch with ICON. Really interested to hear a little bit more about this and what it will mean with regards to patient assessment, both at site and in home. Could you expand upon Accellacare broadly for the audience?
Sure. So ICON a couple of years ago decided to invest in sites because, at the end of the day, the biggest delays that you see in clinical trials, and I think it's something like 85% or 87%, the number's right around that, right there. It's just below 90%, it's not good. Trials do not finish on time. And the number one reason trials do not finish on time is because they don't get through enrollment on time. And there's lots of reasons around that, whether it's, wrong investigators, just a patient population that's evolved or changed and no longer out there that are eligible for the nuances that people put in their protocols. But it's all about the patient and finding the patient. So we were trying to go to the what, as my CEO would call, the last mile, which is how do you get to the patient, and really decided to make that investment in having our own site network. So we acquired a couple companies. One of them was PMG, the other one was Medanova. So both in the US and in Europe. And these site networks embed study coordinators into physicians' offices. And these are physicians that have an interest in clinical research, but may or may not have the time or experience to do clinical research. And so we own some sites, we partner on some sites and embed the nursing facilities in there, and then we have our network of sites that we work with. We've relaunched it this year as Excelicare, but it allows us access to the EMRs so that we can start pinpointing where the patients are in the medical systems, and then we can go and work with those physicians that actually are seeing those patients to encourage them to be part of clinical research and then make them successful by embedding the site staff that they need. So that's really helped us in regards to speeding up patient enrollment and pulling down some of that barrier that we were seeing around the extended and long and delayed patient recruitment timelines. We're also launching another group called OncoCare. That'll be launching in 2021. And that group is specifically focused in the oncology space. Excelicare falls more in cardiovascular, CNS, women's disease, vaccines, kind of the general spectrum of indications out there, and a good portion of our business. But it's been great because now that we have the Excelicare and with Symphony coming on, we have both stand-up sites that we can leverage and that also are already connected into our systems, which allows the data to flow more rapidly. So what we're seeing is, in general, when we use our Excelicare sites, patient recruitment happens faster, the data quality is better, patient safety is good, and we see a much lower level of dropouts or loss to follow-up. And so all in general, the output of that is very clean and very neat, and it's really what our sponsors are looking for. So Excelicare can be leveraged whether it's part of an ICON trial or whether the sponsor just wants to come and work with the sites themselves. So we've set it up to be both standalone and embedded into our day-to-day.
And has there been an impact from a COVID-19 standpoint on the execution of that in any way this year?
We, like everybody else, there are the rules when certain countries close down. We had to close down, but we did. We were able to keep our Excelicare sites open at least one day a week to ensure that patients had a place to go if they needed to, and they had access to drug if they needed to pick up drug, and it was a drug that couldn't be deployed via via home delivery setting for the studies. So our studies continued on, and specifically with COVID-19, we're conducting about 100 trials right now in the COVID space, and Excelicare has been a major component to the enrollment in those. We're running a couple of very large vaccine studies right now, and they've enrolled thousands of patients on those trials. So having them be with us and embedded in us and understand our therapeutic area and the way of working has really helped us to be able to achieve some crazy recruitment timelines that you're seeing right now in the drug development space, specifically on COVID.
Absolutely, yeah. It certainly seems to be very timely then, so with regards to what has happened in 2020 and then ultimately what it has meant from a clinical standpoint. So Kim, we've talked about a lot so far. We've talked about, new innovation coming in that is disrupting clinical research and clinical trials overall. We've discussed the advent of decentralized trials, digital endpoints, the utilizations of new technologies and different arms of industry that can ultimately, have better outcome for patient care. And from that perspective, how far do you think we are as a broader industry from the widespread adoption of more of these digital disruptive technologies overall?
Good question. It's funny because a lot of people are looking to see what the Googles of the world are going to do in some of these large data repository areas. And you've got Apple out there, you've got all the different iWatch capabilities, and people are wearing sensors all the time now, and that's collecting data all the time now. And so we've been waiting to see what's happening out in that space. And I do think you're going to see somebody that's not of clinical research come in and really kind of throw a bomb in on data or data collection or data analytics in the space. You saw that a little bit when IMS and Quintiles merged, and you had a much larger data repository coming into clinical research, and they are certainly leveraging their data and their data analytics capabilities in regards to trying to help identify and pinpoint patients on trials. But I think you're going to see people like Google or Apple or those type of companies come in with just a load of secondary data that will be needed specifically in my space when you look at needing to create evidence for marketing, post-marketing for payers and providers longer term. I think that secondary data element will be coming in, and it'll be coming in from somebody outside the industry again. And it'll be really interesting to see how that pushes us forward, because those technologies now and just their capabilities have just evolved so rapidly. And even now, a lot of these sensors and step counters and everything else that people are wearing, you can actually enter like a nature of disease type trial where they're just collecting data off of your iWatch or your smartphone on a regular basis. So I think we're going to see a lot of research come out of that down the road. It'll be interesting to see, but I think it will really advance how we're looking at certain disease states and kind of the treatment paradigm that ends up happening longer term in that space.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I do think, that as an industry, we do need to keep our eye on some of those more non-traditional disruptors. You mentioned the Googles and the Amazons of the world. Absolutely. It's certainly something that I think we're already beginning to see the beginning of, particularly within telehealth. Google, Amazon, and Apple even are all making moves within that area. So it absolutely is a space that we do need to watch moving forward. And I do think that with the advent of COVID and the pandemic that has ensued, changes within this industry are taking place at an incredibly accelerated pace. So definitely whereby I think all imagined we wouldn't like what we've seen this year over the course of many years, with regards to the regulation that has changed, the accelerated pace of trials, even vaccine development. I do think that, with regards to the movement of some of these less traditional incumbents, it will be a lot quicker than we all think, certainly.
Yep.
So with regards to the next 6 to 12 months, what do you think the key drivers for this change will be? What do you talk to me a little bit more about what you think those drivers will be? Hopefully, fingers crossed, as we emerge from the pandemic and, take active steps into the new normal, whatever that may be.
I think there's a couple things. Well, the first part of it, if you look at just the vaccine development space, I mean, to be able to identify, stand up, conduct, 30, 60,000 patient studies and get that submitted to the agencies and actually potentially have something approved within 12 months is radical, totally radical for our industry. And that in and of itself should help push some advances in being able to move our drug development through faster. As I said earlier, it still averages almost 10 years from discovery to get a drug into the market space, and yet here we are trying to do it in a 12-month period of time because of COVID. So if you can do it for COVID, it kind of says, okay, you know, if quality's there, patient safety's been monitored and maintained, what can we do for real going forward? So I would say that should be an area that the industry is really looking at to see some key drivers for change and some better innovation and data share to be able to make clinical decisions in a faster, more timely manner and get that needed IP out, investigational product out into the market space faster. I think for us as a company and us as an industry, what we've seen in the last 6 months, I think are really going to become part of the new norm for the next 6 to 12 months. So more remote SDV, remote source data verification. You're going to see a lot more deployment of nurses to homes. I think you're going to see a lot more companies focusing on how do you de-risk a trial to make sure that if the pandemic surges again, or if there's any issues, that we are still able to maintain. I think going through this the first time, on the conservative side, a lot of people put a pause, or they slowed down, or they closed down randomization or study entry to new patients while they were trying to figure out what they were going to do. But I think what you're going to see in the next 6 to 12 months is research has got to continue on. We've now kind of figured out what is the minimum basis of technology and innovation we need in order to keep our trials moving going forward. And I think that's what you're going to start seeing is a lot of the things that have been put in place ad hoc become the new norm as we move forward with that. So that's exciting, because I think that's really moving the industry forward much faster than we've seen the first time through. You know, I referred back to the paper days when I started, but when you think about electronic data capture, which is such a standard norm now, it was almost 20 years for that to become a standard norm. And all it was doing was taking the data from a piece of paper and having a site just enter it into the system rather than write it on a piece of paper first. So, I mean, if you think how long that took to adopt and how quickly we're adopting remote source data verification, remote monitoring, deploying nurses to people's homes, I mean, that evolution has happened quite quickly. So hopefully we will see this as the new norm going forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, I couldn't agree more with that response. So thank you for that, Kim. ICON, I think it's fair for me to say, is, you know, one of the leaders within the clinical trial space, you know, and where ICON goes, others follow. So maybe as my final question, what's on the horizon for ICON moving forward, and what can we expect to see from the organization, and perhaps what can others expect from ICON as everyone, as I mentioned, you know, everyone's looking left and right to see what their competitors are doing. So what's on the horizon for ICON?
I think for us, we are really looking to evolve in our space. I mean, I don't think ICON's looking to move into ancillary spaces or go more preclinical or own compounds or anything along those lines. I think we're very clear in our space, and we're definitely a service organization working with pharma devices and diagnostics. I would say for us, what we're trying to do is really evolve our day-to-day operating models, so that we can help really focus on decreasing the timelines for clinical trials and ensuring that we're getting the much needed cures out there to the patient community, regardless of how that's done. I think you're going to see a lot more around the technology and the evolution or the implementation of new approaches and new ways of doing things. We've been very focused and always have been very focused on technology helping to drive the change. And so I think you're going to see that. I think you're going to see a lot more around the real world data space and kind of the evidence generation that's going to require. And hopefully some of that will lead back into earlier development as we look at different ways to to support the protocol development and really the gathering of the data needed for market applications and reimbursement on the latter space. So I think you're going to see us move much more into a technology front position going forward.
Well, we all will certainly be watching this space, definitely. I think that ICON are always, you know, one of the more exciting companies within this industry that we definitely need to kind of keep our eye on. As I said, where ICON goes, others follow. So thank you so much, Kim, for all of your answers today. It's been a wonderful discussion. I know that it's been incredibly informative and insightful for myself, and I'm sure that the audience feel the same way. Certainly illuminating with regards to the future of clinical research and what we can all expect as we tentatively step into the new normal, hopefully sooner rather than later, but we'll keep our fingers crossed. So we do have some time for Q&A, but before we jump into that, I do just want to mention from an Enterprise Ireland perspective. So Kim, you'll just give me 1 second to talk a little bit about the supports that are available from an EI standpoint for the client companies that will be joining us today. We do have our Sustaining Enterprise Fund that's available for client companies. I have linked the details below. If you do have any questions with regards to this Enterprise Fund, please do not hesitate to reach out. If you have any questions around any other types of funding or support that would be accessible to you, please reach out to your development advisor. Again, I've linked there where you can find that information. And then I've also linked finally some information with regards to the Enterprise Ireland COVID-19 hub, which will give you a lot of insight with regards to COVID and additional information around the pandemic and what it will mean for you and for your company. So there are some of the supports that are available from an Enterprise Ireland perspective. Of course, I would strongly encourage anyone joining us today to reach out not only to your development advisor, but also to your market advisor should you have any questions. And do not hesitate to reach out either to myself or to Kim through the chat with any questions that you may have during the remainder of our webinar today. We have had a couple of questions come in, so I do think that we can switch to our Q&A section now. The first question that I'm seeing coming in here is, what advice, Kim, would you give to companies trying to cope with the impact of such disruptive innovation? We've mentioned that during the call today as a result of COVID-19. And how should they differentiate from what can be considered as urgent changes that need to be made immediately versus important changes that maybe need to be made or could be made further down the line?
So what we've done as a company, well, when COVID first hit, we had a business continuity group that we launched. We have it normally anyway. Earthquakes, hurricane seasons, everything else do impact our research. And then you had a pandemic, so it's kind of a little bit on the bigger side than you know, a hurricane hitting the southern part of the United States or something along those lines. So we did have good response, immediate response, and that allowed us to really prioritize what was critically important. And obviously, with us being in research, the criticality was patient safety. How do you protect the patient in an environment that's not controlled right now? And so the response team really sat down and thought about pretty much everything you can think of from a patient perspective. And then we started going through our systems and our processes to see what we had to modify or change because COVID hit. You know, obviously we talked a little bit around medication, but in a clinical trial or any kind of trial that you're running, you have to be able to get the medication to your patients, and that was critical. And that was not something that was standard part of our protocols or anything along those lines. We run across every country in the world, and so you're really deploying a lot of different entities out to a lot of space. So that was critical number one. How do you keep patients safe? How do you get drugs to patients? Now, when you start moving into remote monitoring and some of the other things, it's important. Data integrity is always important in trials, but that was not the critical aspect. It was keeping patients safe. It was looking at our investigators and seeing what they needed in order to keep in touch with their patients. It was looking at the protocols to ensure that we could keep our studies running and patients enrolled without having to change the design or date or change what we were doing. So we kind of went through it from that perspective. So my advice would be definitely make sure that you probably already have it, but having some level of business continuity plans in place that you can then deploy immediately, but then having the small task force to really look at and prioritize from the business continuity plans which ones are urgent versus which ones are important would be my suggestion.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really, really strong answer with regards to trying to cut through the noise, of which there is a lot at the moment, and keeping focused on patient care is certainly something to stand by. Another question that we've had come in regards decentralized trials, which we spoke about a lot during our webinar today. And you touched a little bit upon it, but the question is, what must be considered from a patient privacy and data protection perspective when we're talking about decentralized trials and digital endpoints moving forward?
It's how that data moves from the patient through to the central body that's collecting the information to analyze. Data protection, data privacy means that the patient has to know exactly where the data is going, and at any point in time, they can remove the data from the environment. So there's a lot of rules and regulations around that, and it's not just me consenting and you can take my data and take it all over the world. There's also rules about where that data can be moved to and where it has to be stored. So I think those were the big areas that we're still working through when you start looking at big global studies and data privacy and data protection, because not all data that you extract from electronic medical record can be taken out of country. So some of it is very oriented to one area, one country, single source, has to stay there, and it falls outside of the old traditional safe harbor environment because the rules have changed. So you definitely need to really think about data flow and how you're going to run your analytics and how you maintain the privacy of the patient when the patient's actually probably entering something in off their smartphone. How do you anonymize that so that you don't know it's Jane Doe? Because you're not supposed to know that. So it's complicated, but a lot of things have ways of pulling in the data and stripping off the personal components of it. So it's just data points and not the audit trail around the who and what kind of goes away. So there's a lot of little hurdles and obstacles you need to be careful about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with things moving at such a quick pace during the pandemic, regulatory hurdles around data protection and patient privacy are just one of the probably many bottlenecks we'll see as we move closer to the widespread adoption of this type of technology. Kim, that concludes the webinar today. I thank you once again for your time. It's been a fantastic conversation and discussion, really, really illuminating, very insightful. I greatly appreciate your knowledge and expertise today, and thank you once again for your time.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. So thank you very much, and stay safe in this crazy environment. And
absolutely, yeah, stay safe, and let's see how the rest of 2020 plays out. Hopefully no more surprises, but stay safe, and we will no doubt speak again soon.
Absolutely, take care.
Bye.
Bye.